Hello, this is a tutorial for the new Unity tool Prefab Summoner. Start by adding a new Prefab Summoner game object. This is the help section. It contains some basic information that should get you started. Most of the options also have detailed tooltips. This is where you switch between the two main modes, single and multiple. You can also switch to the settings panel. You can only paint new objects on other objects that belong to the layers selected here. Every object you'll be painting on should have a collider. Let's create a layer for our terrain. Now let's choose it on our Prefab Summoner. We now need to add some new prefabs. We can add a single prefab by dragging it onto the blue box. We can also add many prefabs at a time. There are two ways to do that. For the first one, lock your Prefab Summoner and then add your prefabs as usual. For the second one, drag your prefabs on the Prefab Summoner game object while in single mode. Now we can begin painting. Let's see how painting works in single mode. Start by clicking on the desired position and then drag your mouse away from that. This will uniformly scale your object. We can also rotate the mouse around the center to change the object's local Y rotation. If we stop dragging our mouse, the new object will be placed. But let's say we don't want to do that. If we press Ctrl again, dragging our mouse will rotate the object around its local X and Z axis at the same time. We can also scale the object non-uniformly. To do this, while still dragging the mouse, press Alt. By dragging the mouse along the directions the arrows are pointing, we will increase the scale of the object in the X and Z axis. If we press Alt again, we can do the same thing for the local Y axis. And finally we can press C. This will let us move the object along its local Y axis. This is useful if your object lies above or below the ground. If you hold Z while doing this, you will do it with greater precision. Now we can just stop dragging our mouse. All of these keys are the default settings, but you can change them in the settings panel. Now let's say we disable Pick Random. We may change our object A by selecting it on the inspector, or B by pressing space. The first option is Pick Random. This will select a new random game object each time you paint. Enabling Use Surface Direction will make the new object's local Y axis point towards the underlying surface's direction. Disabling it will make the object point upwards. This option adds a small initial offset along the surface's direction. We may also delete some of these objects that were placed by this specific instance of Prefab Summoner. We can do this using our delete brush. Let's set its radius first. Now hold B and drag your mouse over the objects. Let's see a second way. Hold N and press anywhere on the object you want to delete. Next, we have the scale threshold. This sets a minimum scale for your new object, below which it will be automatically deleted. This is meant to protect us from accidental clicks, which would otherwise create new objects with zero scale. This is the Place on Scene grid option. It lets you place new objects on an arbitrary 2D grid in your scene. By default, this is Unity's 2D grid. Now you can place your new objects as usual. The next option lets us choose whether precision mode should be enabled by default in scale mode. If it is enabled, then we can get out of it by holding Z. If it is not enabled by default, then we can get into it by holding Z again. This option does not apply to uniform scaling. Now we aren't in precision mode. Let's hold Z. Precision mode is also available while moving the object. Let's look at the snapping options. First, we can snap the object scale, and we can even do it differently for each axis. We can also snap the object's rotation. The values entered are in degrees. The next snapping option, Snap Position to Grid, only works when Place on Scene grid is activated. The values entered, which are again in units, define the grid's cell size. Unity's default grid has a cell size of 10. New objects will be placed on the vertices defined by those cells. We can also clamp the scale of an object. Below we can set the minimum and maximum X, Y and Z values. If relative to prefab is not enabled, these will be absolute values. Otherwise, they will be relative to the prefab's original scale. Without relative to prefab, if the original prefab does not have a scale of 1 on all three axes, then it might get distorted. We can see here that its proportions have changed. That's why relative to prefab is useful. If we placed too many objects in the scene, we can combine them to reduce draw calls and increase performance. You do not need to worry about how many objects can fit in a single chunk. This operation affects only objects placed by this specific instance of Prefab Summoner that are currently on its list and were placed in this specific draw mode. Chunk size defines how large each chunk will be in units. However, this is only a starting point. If the objects do not fit in a single chunk, then it will be subdivided. If Destroy Merged is enabled, then the old individual objects will be destroyed. If not, they will be kept with disabled renderers. If Disable All is enabled, then the whole gameobjects will be disabled. Before beginning the actual optimization, you always need to preview the chunks. Our old objects are disabled, and new chunks have been created. Let's take a look at some of the settings. The first three sliders define how sensitive our object placement will be to mouse movements. The next two options are used along with the Place on Scene grid mode. These two define where the 2D grid will be. For example, this is Unity's second grid while in 2D mode. Let's enter 2D mode. It looks like our scaling sensitivity is a bit low. Let's increase it. We will now try to create some 3D platforms. This is something that could be used in prototyping. Let's look at the common settings. If child to target is enabled, then any object placed will become a child of the object it is placed on. This sets the minimum and maximum size of the delete brush in single mode and the general brush in multiple mode. And finally, below you can customize all of the keys used. Let's take a look at multiple mode. You can add new prefabs in the same way. The same prefab can be added multiple times with different settings. The option Use Surface Direction is exactly the same as before. Using this slider, we can change the radius of the brush. We can also press C to decrease it or V to increase it. The minimum and maximum radius can be changed in the settings. Here we can set the weight of each object. This defines how likely it is to be spawned in a single stroke. Now we are ready to begin creating some objects. You can see that some of them are overlapping. We'll fix this in a minute. To delete them, we can enable the delete brush. Hold B and drag the mouse over the object you want to delete, just like in single mode. Let's see stroke max count. This defines the maximum number of objects that will be spawned in a single stroke. Let's set this to 20. Don't set this too high or your brush might start lagging. Let's undo this now. Stroke distance defines the distance between each stroke. 1 means 1 brush diameter. I usually set this somewhere between 0.7 and 1. Let's exaggerate this a bit to see how it works. The scatter option would help us fix the overlapping objects. To use it, first set it to something greater than 0. Next, set the dist value for its prefab. This defines a radius around that object in which no other object will be placed. We can see that it now only works on the peppermints. Now let's also fix our chocolates. Next, we can choose if we want to randomize the object's rotation and scale. This can be set differently for each object. These are the scaling options, minimum and maximum. If the random scale checkbox is not enabled, then the minimum scale will be used for all objects. This will also be absolute values unless the relative to prefab checkbox is enabled, just like in single mode. The random rot Y slider adds a random rotation around the local Y-axis. The random rot X and Z slider adds a random rotation between minus that value and plus that value. The X and Z axes are randomized separately. If we enable the uniform checkbox next to the scaling values, then all three axes will use the values defined for the X-axis. We need to enable the random scale checkbox, or the scaling will not be randomized. The same applies to the random rotation checkbox. Now let's delete them and make the scale uniform. Finally, let's randomize our rotation. We also have the max slope option. This defines the maximum slope a new object can be placed on. Another important option is the Use First Rotation and Scale mode. This will make all prefabs use the rotation and scale values of the first prefab. This can be handy when you have a lot of prefabs, but you don't need that much control. Now let's place a lot of objects. If we press play, we can see that our FPS is suffering from the massive number of game objects. It sits around 85 FPS or 11.5 milliseconds per frame. Let's create even more objects. Now our FPS is even worse, around 55. So let's put our objects into chunks, the same way we did in single mode. Now we've got over 500 FPS and around 2 milliseconds per frame. Here we can see the settings for multiple modes. If your brush feels laggy, then you can try disabling the undo functionality. You can change the up direction. This is the direction the local y-axis of the object will be facing when Use Surface Direction is disabled. You can also define how much influence the Use Surface Direction option will have. The final option is Global Scatter. By default, each Prefab Summoner does not take into account other Prefab Summoners when scattering objects. This option changes that and also lets you choose which Prefab Summoners you'll take into account. Now we have a second Prefab Summoner. Let's add some different game objects. Now we will create some objects with our original Prefab Summoner. Now enable Global Scatter and add the other Prefab Summoner under the Global Scatter Summoners. Scattering should work fine now. And that's everything you need to know. I hope this tool helps you as much as it has helped me. Thanks for watching.